In the bustling city of New York, where tales of romance and horror intermingle beneath the towering skyscrapers, Sarah, a 28-year-old graphic designer, decided to plunge back into the dating pool. After a series of unremarkable dates, she stumbled upon a profile on Tinder that caught her attention. The man, named Alex, was 30, with striking features and an enigmatic charm. His profile was sparse, but what drew her were his intense eyes and the mysterious, almost alluring way he described his interests, exploring the unexplored, finding beauty in the darkness. After a few days of engaging conversation about art, horror movies, and their mutual appreciation for the underrated beauty of rainy nights, Alex suggested they meet. He proposed something unconventional for their first date. Instead of a typical dinner or a bar visit, he invited her to an abandoned subway station he claimed was his favorite place to explore and photograph. Sarah, intrigued and a bit adventurous herself, agreed. They planned the date for a Friday night. Alex instructed her to meet him at a lesser-known entrance of the subway system, assuring her that he'd bring all necessary equipment for their urban exploration, flashlights, gloves, and even an extra camera if she wanted to take photos. The thrill of the adventure quelled Sarah's initial apprehensions. However, as she approached the designated meeting spot that evening, a shiver that wasn't entirely due to the crisp autumn air ran down her spine. The street was dimly lit, the only light emanating from a flickering street lamp. Alex was nowhere to be seen, so she texted him to let him know she had arrived. Minutes ticked by, deepening Sarah's anxiety. Just as she considered leaving, her phone buzzed. Alex had apologized for running late and asked her to go ahead inside, guiding her to a graffiti-covered service door that he said would lead her directly into the abandoned station. Reluctantly, Sarah pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges echoing into the dark corridor ahead. She turned on her flashlight, and as the beam cut through the darkness, her heart began to pound louder in her chest. The corridor was lined with old, peeling posters and debris. She walked slowly, her footsteps sounding unnaturally loud as she ventured deeper into the subway's underbelly. The further she went, the more her unease grew. The air was musty, filled with the smell of damp and decay. As she rounded a corner, she finally saw Alex's silhouette waiting by an old turnstile. He was taller than she'd imagined, his figure casting a long shadow that merged with the darkness of the tunnels. "Sorry for the creepy intro," Alex said with a chuckle as he stepped forward, flashlight in hand. "I promise it's worth it. This place is really something at night." Sarah managed a nervous smile, her instincts screaming that something was off, but her curiosity pushed her doubts aside. They ventured together into the depths of the station, Alex leading the way and pointing out old architectural features and pieces of obscure graffiti. As they delved deeper, Alex's demeanor began to change. His charming anecdotes shifted towards darker subjects, stories of people who had disappeared in the subway, rumors of hauntings, and his fascination with the macabre. Sarah's discomfort grew with each story, her initial intrigue souring into fear. Then, they reached a part of the station that Alex claimed was his favorite, the tracks of a forgotten line that never saw completion. The tunnel here was narrower, the walls closer, as if they could close in on her at any moment. "It's just through here," Alex said, gesturing towards an even darker, narrower passage that branched off from the main area. Sarah hesitated, her fear getting the better of her. "Maybe we should head back," she suggested, but Alex was insistent. "Trust me, you don't want to miss this," he urged, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made her stomach churn. As they approached the passage, Alex suddenly stopped, turning to face her. His expression was no longer friendly, it was cold, calculating. "You know, I'm glad you came," he began, his tone ominous. "It's not often I get to share this with someone who truly appreciates it." Before Sarah could react, Alex produced a rope from his backpack. Panic surged through her as she realized his intentions. She turned to run, but the narrowness of the tunnel hindered her escape. The story leaves off here, with Sarah's realization of the danger she's in, her fight or flight response kicking in as she faces a horrifying situation far beneath the city's bustling streets. Sarah's heart pounded against her chest like a drum as she spun on her heels, trying to sprint back toward the main area of the subway station. The beam of her flashlight bobbed wildly, casting frantic, dancing shadows against the decaying walls. Her breath was loud in her ears, a harsh, ragged sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the confined space. Behind her, she could hear Alex's footsteps, quick and determined, steadily gaining on her. His presence loomed large in the narrow corridor, his intentions as dark as the tunnel they were in. Sarah knew she couldn't outrun him in this maze of forgotten subway lines. She needed to hide, to find a way to evade him and get back to the surface. In a desperate bid for safety, Sarah veered off into a small maintenance room she barely noticed, its door hanging ajar. She slipped inside, her hands trembling as she gently closed the door behind her, trying not to make a sound. The room was cramped, filled with old tools and rusted machinery, remnants of a bygone era of transit glory. She crouched behind a large metal cabinet, her body squeezed into the small space, barely daring to breathe. Outside, Alex's voice echoed down the tunnel, calling out to her in a sing-song tone, chilling her to the bone. "Sarah, come on out. You can't hide in here forever. We're meant to experience this together." His footsteps stopped right outside the maintenance room, and for a moment, Sarah thought her heart might stop from sheer terror. She could hear him breathing, a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to probe the darkness for any sign of her. Then, moving with sudden decisiveness, Alex pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room, inches from the cabinet behind which Sarah hid. She closed her eyes, praying silently that he wouldn't find her. After what felt like an eternity, the light moved away, and his footsteps receded. Sarah waited, counting slowly to 100 before daring to peek out. The room was empty. Alex had moved on, his search taking him deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels. Knowing she had only moments to act, Sarah emerged from her hiding place and hurried back the way they had come. The darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides, a tangible force that threatened to swallow her whole. Every noise made her jump, every shadow a potential threat. As she navigated the twisted pathways of the abandoned subway, a plan began to form in her mind. If she could reach the surface, find a way to contact the police, perhaps she could lead them back here. She just needed to get out, to escape the oppressive darkness of Old Hollow's underbelly. But the tunnels were confusing, a maze designed not for the public but for the trains that once rattled through them. Several times, Sarah thought she recognized a landmark, only to find herself facing a dead end or an unfamiliar passage. Panic began to set in as the realization dawned on her that she might be lost. Suddenly, she heard a noise that froze her in her tracks, a low, dragging sound, followed by the unmistakable echo of footsteps. Alex was still searching for her, and by the sound of it, he was close. Ducking into another maintenance alcove, Sarah held her breath, listening as the steps grew nearer. Then, just as the footsteps seemed right upon her, they stopped. A voice, not Alex's, whispered through the darkness, "This way." Startled, Sarah looked up to see a small, dim light flickering in the distance, a light she hadn't noticed before. It was coming from a torch, held by a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel. The figure was motioning to her, urging her to come closer. Torn between the instinct to flee from this new unknown and the terror of Alex finding her, Sarah made a split-second decision. She crept from her hiding place and began moving toward the figure with the torch, her every instinct screaming caution, yet driven by the desperate hope of finding an ally. As she drew closer, the figure stepped into the light, revealing features that were oddly familiar yet impossible to place, a face that seemed to belong to the subway itself, lined and aged like the tunnels around them. The story pauses here, with Sarah approaching the mysterious figure, her fate hanging in the balance between the horrors behind her and the uncertain salvation ahead. What secrets does the figure hold? Can they guide her safely out, or is their presence another layer in the dark depths of the subway's history? The dim, flickering light offers little comfort as the shadows grow deeper and the echoes of the past whisper through the tunnels. As Sarah approached the figure, the narrow beam of the torch cast an eerie glow in the otherwise oppressive darkness of the subway tunnel. The figure's face, worn and lined as though etched by time itself, seemed almost a part of the subway, a ghost of the city's forgotten underbelly. "Hurry, child," the figure whispered, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like the scraping of metal against stone. "He's coming." The urgency in the figure's tone spurred Sarah into action, her feet moving faster despite the fatigue that clawed at her muscles. She followed closely as the figure led her through a labyrinth of tunnels and maintenance shafts, areas of the subway that felt abandoned by time, places where the modern city above seemed like a distant memory. They moved silently, the only sound the occasional drip of water from the leaking ceiling above and their footsteps echoing off the grimy walls. Sarah tried to keep up with the figure, whose pace was surprisingly quick for someone of his seemingly advanced age. As they hurried along, the figure began to speak, his voice a whisper that was almost lost in the cavernous tunnels. "I was once like you, curious, drawn to the mysteries of the deep. But this place, it takes more than it gives. It took everything from me." Sarah wanted to ask questions, to understand who this person was and how he came to live in this forgotten part of the city, but the fear of Alex's pursuit pressed her to keep moving. The urgency was palpable, the feeling that they were being hunted, a tangible shadow at their backs. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small, cramped room that looked like an old control booth. The walls were lined with decaying maps and old control panels, their buttons and levers long since inert. The figure gestured for her to enter, his hand trembling as he pointed to a rusted metal chair in the center of the room. "Sit, rest," he said, setting the torch down on a makeshift table crafted from old subway tokens and discarded papers. "You are safe here, for a moment." Sarah sat, her breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps as she tried to calm her racing heart. The figure stood at the doorway, his gaze fixed on the dark corridor they had just traversed. "What is this place?" Sarah finally asked, her voice a whisper in the dim light. "It was once a command center, back when these tunnels were new and full of life. Now, it's my refuge, a place to hide from the darkness that roams these passageways," the figure replied, his eyes never leaving the tunnel entrance. "Who are you?" Sarah continued, her curiosity battling her fear. The figure turned to look at her, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight. "My name is Thomas," he said, "and I was once an engineer for the subway, many years ago. I came down here to escape the world above, to hide from a life I could no longer face. But I found myself trapped, wandering these tunnels, lost in the shadows." Thomas's story seemed almost as unbelievable as the situation Sarah found herself in. But there was a sincerity in his voice that made her want to trust him, to believe that he might be her ally in this nightmare. Suddenly, a noise from down the tunnel caught their attention, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the damp air. Thomas's face tightened, and he quickly extinguished the torch, plunging the room into darkness. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's here." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she listened to the approaching footsteps, each step a thunderous beat in the silent room. She realized then that Alex had not given up his pursuit, that his obsession had driven him deeper into the tunnels, following her into the dark. The story leaves off here, with Sarah and Thomas hiding in the dark, waiting as Alex's footsteps grow ever closer, the tension almost unbearable. What plans does Alex have, and can Thomas be trusted? The darkness of the subway holds many secrets, and as the echoes of the past converge with the present, the true horror of what lies beneath may soon be revealed. In the oppressive darkness of the control booth, Sarah's breaths were shallow, her body tensed for any action that might be necessary. Thomas remained motionless, a sentinel at the doorway, his presence both reassuring and enigmatic. The footsteps grew louder, closer, a relentless approach that echoed the pounding of Sarah's heart. Just as the steps seemed to be right outside the door, they suddenly stopped. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, as if the air itself was waiting for what would come next. Minutes passed, each second stretching into eternity as Sarah and Thomas listened intently, barely daring to breathe. Then, without warning, the silence was shattered by a loud crash, a sound of metal being violently struck. Sarah jumped, her nerves frayed to breaking point. Thomas put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort, but his grip was tight, urgent. "He's trying to break in," Thomas whispered, his voice tinged with fear. "We need to move, now." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. They couldn't stay here, the booth would not hold Alex off for long. Thomas led the way, navigating through a back exit that Sarah hadn't noticed before. This new tunnel was narrower, the walls closing in around them as they moved. As they hurried through the darkness, the only sound was their footsteps and the distant, muffled noise of Alex trying to break through the barricade they had left behind. Thomas seemed to know these tunnels like the back of his hand, turning this way and that through the labyrinthine network, but to Sarah, it felt like they were just going deeper into the bowels of the earth. Suddenly, Thomas stopped. Ahead of them, the tunnel branched in two, each path disappearing into utter blackness. He hesitated, his head turning first one way, then the other, his decision unclear. "Which way?" Sarah whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. I'm not sure," Thomas admitted, his tone betraying a hint of uncertainty for the first time. "It's been years since I've been this deep. We might be under the old city section now." The realization that even Thomas was unsure of their path struck a new wave of terror into Sarah's heart. If Thomas lost his way, they could be wandering these tunnels indefinitely, or worse, run straight into Alex. As they stood at the crossroads, uncertain and afraid, the sound of footsteps echoed once again through the tunnels, this time from the way they had come. Alex had broken through. With no time to deliberate, Thomas made a snap decision and pulled Sarah down the left tunnel. They ran, their footsteps desperate and uneven on the damp, uneven floor. The tunnel here was older, the air stale and heavy with the scent of mold. They pushed on, driven by the primal urge to survive, until they emerged into a large underground chamber. It was an old subway platform, abandoned and forgotten. The tracks were rusty, the platform cracked and overgrown with moss. It looked like a place that time had forgotten, a ghost station. "This is it," Thomas said, breathing heavily. "We can hide here for a bit." But even as he spoke, the sound of footsteps reached their ears again. Alex was still coming, relentless as a hunter on the trail of his prey. They looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the platform offered little cover. Sarah's eyes caught on an old maintenance door at the far end of the platform. "There," she pointed, and they sprinted towards it. The door was stuck, but together they managed to force it open, slipping inside just as Alex's shadow appeared at the entrance to the chamber. Inside the maintenance room, they found an old ladder leading up to a manhole cover. It was a way out, a potential escape to the streets above. "We need to go, now," Sarah urged, climbing the ladder. Thomas followed, and together they pushed at the cover. It was heavy, but slowly, it began to move. Just as the cover gave way, allowing the faint light of the city night to filter in, a shout came from below. Alex had found the maintenance room. There was a clatter as he began to climb the ladder after them. Sarah and Thomas pushed with all their strength, the manhole cover finally giving way. They scrambled out onto the street, the cold night air a sharp contrast to the stifling tunnel below. Panting, they replaced the cover just as Alex reached the top of the ladder. The story ends here, with Sarah and Thomas safe on the surface, but with the lingering threat of Alex still below. The streets of New York loom around them, the city's lights a stark reminder of the world they had temporarily left behind. They are safe for now, but the horror of what happened in the tunnels will haunt them, a chilling reminder that some depths are best left unexplored.